The passage today comes from the Gospel of Mark, and before I read it, I wanted to give you just a brief background on the Gospel of Mark. Mark's Gospel is arguably the first Gospel that was written probably around 65 A.D. We're not sure the exact date, but somewhere around there. About, 20 years after Jesus was crucified. It was also written after the epistles were started. So there are some epistles that were started as early as, we think, maybe around 58-ish, or thereabouts, 56 to 58. And there are some scholars, myself included, that believe that the Gospels were written as a corrective to the epistles, as opposed to a continuation of the gospel message. And this focus, if we look at the Gospels that way, if we look at Mark that way, we see that Mark is a fast-paced, very in-your-face, no-holds-barred reading of Jesus' early ministry. And the first part of that ministry we find in the passage I'm going to read here in a minute, which is the call to be a fisher of people, a call to be an evangelist. And so that's what I'd like to start off our reading with, is a reading from Mark 1, 16 to 18. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. So a fisherman was walking beside a lake, and he passed a game warden, and there was a huge line. He was carrying a huge line of fish over his back, and the game warden said to him, "Great looking fish you got there. Where'd you get them?" And the fisherman said, "Well, come with me and I'll show you." So he took the game warden out in his boat, took out a stick of dynamite, lit it, threw it in the water, and after a shuddering blast, the fish came floating to the surface. The game warden said, "That is the most illegal way I have ever seen of catching fish. You're coming with me." With that, the fisherman took out another stick of dynamite, lit it, handed it to the game warden, and said, "You going to talk or are you going to fish?" Now that's how I should fish, okay? I simply have no luck or skill when it comes to fishing. My son-in-law, Kevin, on the other hand, is an avid fisherman and outdoorsman. He is a very different kind of fisherman than me, for sure. First, he's a catch and release fisherman. He fishes for sport and not for food. He also studies fish. He knows their habitats and their habits and their idiosyncrasies. He knows whether they're attracted to jerking bait or wiggling bait or dull bait, and he studies the lake, and he knows the right depth and the fishing line, what kind of fishing line to use, and the ideal water temperatures and the best phases of the moon and wind. He has a huge fund of knowledge about the certain kinds of bait to be used, whether they're worms or jigs or spinners or spoons or flies or plugs, and the list goes on, of course. Most especially, he's patient. He can sit for hours and wait. No talking, of course, just waiting. And for those of you that know me, that's really quite a hard sell, is not talking. And he won't even invite me to go fishing with him anymore, especially since 9/11 has put a restriction on my access to dynamite. But seriously, perhaps we can learn something from Kevin, not just about fishing for fish, but also what Jesus had in mind, referring to fishing for new followers, fishing for people. So what does it mean to fish for people in the year 2020? 19, almost 2,000 years after Jesus first summoned his earliest followers to be agents of his radical progressive worldview, his radical progressive message, and his radical progressive things that he did that were so countercultural, counter-religious, counter-political, that ultimately got him killed. First, it might be helpful to look at Jesus and these early fishermen's cultural, political, economic, and social context. Their worldview was that of a very unsafe place. There was a huge disparity between the haves and the have-nots. For most folks, it was subsistence living with rampant hunger and devastating disease. Women, children, people on the margins, and the enslaved had no voice or vote. Very few folks could read or write. Justice and political systems worked only for the very few folks, and the masses were subjected to the whims of the most powerful. There were emperors and kings and queens, sort of ancient ideas of oligarchs, that used to abuse the hierarchical nature of politics, economics, and society. Worship of the political heads of state was common within most religions. Superstition and magic were prevalent. Power was concentrated in the well-connected and wealthy families, but mostly the males. And there literally were hundreds of religions and philosophies, often resulting in rifts between the various religious expressions, most notably between the Jews and everybody else. Some of this sure sounds familiar, doesn't it? And into this cultural soup, the radical progressive Jesus emerged. His bottom line message was that each person is and should be loved, is and should be valued and important, and this love and respect is and should be offered to people despite their circumstance. In addition, Jesus' progressive message was a call to immediate action, doing things concretely and tangibly to make life better, to make living better, to give people hope, to improve an individual's life, and also to improve the life of the community and the culture right then, and not in the by and by. If you examine the Gospel of Mark closely, Jesus dealt with real, live, human issues: hunger, disease, conflict, interpersonal relations, the systems of oppression. He was not interested in some esoteric theological treatise or idea. He was a practical, radical, progressive, social reformer. He got his hands dirty helping people on their journey. He did concrete things. He made tangible changes in folks' lives. He called others to do the same. He wasn't into philosophy or theology. He was into making a difference then, on the ground, in real time. Is it any wonder they crucified him? So what happened in the 2 decades or so following Jesus' death, in between the time of the Gospels and the time of the epistles? It seems that Jesus' core focus on taking action, in my view, took a back seat to Paul's headier and oftentimes more complex theology. Paul came along and started to push the idea of belief over action, faith over deeds, theology over practice, orthodoxy over orthopraxy. In the 13 letters attributed to Paul, he certainly praised those who did good works, but clearly he was focused on espousing the right set of beliefs and laying out the doctrine and theology of this nascent church movement. Paul pushed the divinity of Jesus, belief in miracles, and he spent a fair amount of time discussing the cosmic battle between good and evil. Paul was concerned about what differentiated a Jew from a follower of Jesus. Paul supercharged his message of salvation with the notion that belief in Jesus was necessary and primary for eternal life. The Jerusalem Council came along around 50 AD and dealt with the question of the relationship between Judaism and the early Christian movement and how belief was superior to deeds. Belief won the day, and believing overdoing became orthodoxy of the first century and was codified in the 4th century. Fundamentalist Christians today rely heavily on the Pauline texts to define what it means to be a modern Christian. I think it's very interesting that despite the emphasis that Jesus placed on deeds in the Gospels, the early church canon had only one letter dedicated to works and deeds, the Epistle of James, where James said that faith without works is dead. It wasn't until fairly recently, when scholars applied rigorous critical thinking and exegetical skills to the story and the biblical text, that there was a reemergence of the importance of the core actions of Jesus. I think it is interesting that those fundamentalist Christian churches that are growing today are growing in large part because they are focusing on the Pauline corpus and not the Gospels. And this is a true story. I was in a conversation with a mega church pastor in the Southern Baptist that came out of the Southern Baptist tradition, and I wanted to see if his church would start to make regular contributions to a local food pantry and clothing pantry. This was in the Kansas City area. In the course of our conversation, this tall steeple preacher shared with me that his overriding challenge was not BIPs. Now, y'all know what BIPs are, right? Butts in pews. That was not his overriding concern. He said that the Sunday show, the professional grade music and production, took care of that. He said that his greatest challenge was to help motivate his congregation to move from Sunday to Monday, from the pews to the streets, from ideas to action, from the head to the hands. At the time, my little church was struggling just to make its budget, and I wasn't terribly sympathetic to his issue. So I rather ungraciously suggested that he start preaching from the Gospels and move away from the Pauline canon as a way to start. Needless to say, my comment was not very well received. When you move from the pews to the streets, offer a piece of bread to the hungry, a blanket to the weary and down and out, a sip of water to the thirsty, medicine to the sick, and advocate for freedom from oppression. When you protest inequity and inequality, when you demand changes in the law to help the less fortunate, when you advocate for universal health care, reproductive justice, gun control, doing away with the prison and military-industrial complexes, when you visit with Native Americans in the dead of winter to protest a pipeline traversing sacred property, when you assist those experiencing the devastation of natural disasters and the impact of climate change, and when you advocate against the caging of kids and families along our borders, when you call out corrupt politicians and income disparity, then this kind of faith expression brings hope in desperate situations. It does what Jesus would have done today. Yes, it also makes you a target for those that want to offer thoughts and prayers and not take real action to change the world. So how does this perspective and worldview apply to fishing for people within the progressive church? I think that there is a direct correlation between Jesus' message and actions and the progressive church's message and actions. Should fishing for people today happen like the large megachurch down the road with its screens, cameras, sound systems, professional staging and lighting, worship services, marketing plans, mailers, energized music productions, and focus on what happens for an hour on Sunday? Or is fishing for progressives different? Should it be different? I think it should be different. I think that we need to focus our progressive evangelism not on BIPs, butts in pews, but FOS, feet on the street. Based on what Roger's told me and what I've seen statistically, there are many folks who are apparently very interested in doing more than simply showing up on Sunday, wearing a nice outfit, singing some standard hymns, listening to an orthodox or liturgically appropriate message, and offering thoughts and prayers. Apparently, there's an itch out there that is longing to be scratched. There are many folks who resonate with taking action, doing concrete things to make this world a better place. There are people who want to do more than talk and pray. They want to act. These are progressives. These are progressives. These are the folks we want to catch. These are the folks that will resonate with the progressive message and progressive actions. So how do we do that? So how are we fishing for people? And more importantly, how should we be fishing for people? Perhaps we can get some counsel from Jesus and some of the catch and release fishermen out there like my son-in-law, Kevin. First, let's deal with some common thoughts about fishing for people. Fishing for progressives is not akin to what commercial fishermen do. Casting their nets in the water and scooping up large quantities of people like fish in a very impersonal, commercial, and methodical way. All measured by BIPs, or cars in the parking lot, or the number of cops channeling traffic on Sunday morning. Next, fishing for progressives is not about propping open the front door of the church and hoping that progressives come swimming in. It's about FOS, feet on the street. Fishing for progressives is about catching folks who are and who will be deployed to the streets, a catch and release program, who are not afraid to get their hands dirty, take risks, or demand change. Do y'all know any potential progressives that are not part of this fellowship, either in person or on the internet? Fishing for progressives is about catching folks who want to apply logic and science and critical thinking to deal with life's real issues. People who are more concerned about how to put food in someone's belly than the number of angels on the head of a pin, or whether sprinkling or dunking will get them into heaven. Know any progressives that are not part of this fellowship, either in person or online, that you could ask? Fishing for progressives is about recruiting what Socrates called gadflies, who are also often known in modern parlance as PITAs, P-I-T-A, pain in the arse. Know any potential progressives out there that are not part of this fellowship, either in person or online? So what's the motivation for fishing for progressives? It's about seeking out folks who are truly interested in dealing with real, live, here and now, cultural, political, economic, social, and religious issues and problems, and empowering these folks to go out into the world and do the hard work of change, sometimes at great personal, financial, or social risk. The progressive message is about hope. Hoping for and working towards a better present and future. The progressive message is a positive message because it says we can do this. We can make a difference. We can affect change. Know any potential progressives out there that are not part of this fellowship, either in person or online? Invite them to come along on this journey. So how do we find other progressives who are willing to become part of the progressive movement? First thing you need to do is just look around. Chances are good you associate with folks that have progressive leanings, attitudes, and mindsets. Ask them, ever heard of Roger Ray? Ever heard of progressive faith and practice? Want to make a real difference in today's world? And then invite them to come along on this journey. Next, as Jesus and Kevin demonstrated, go to where the fish are. There is little to be gained from going to places and speaking with people and inviting those folks whose only focus is to celebrate what they have with little or no regard for what others lack. There is no point in seeking out Sunday or Wednesday so-called Christians. Sure, there may be some changed minds from time to time, But there are plenty of other places to go that are more fruitful and much less aggravating. And where do these potential progressives hang out? Well, they hang out at shelters and food pantries and under the bridge kitchens and political groups and social and environmental economic justice organizations. Check out battered and abused women's shelters or rape crisis centers or hotlines. Go to where folks who might intersect with the progressive faith and practice, go to where they hang out and ask them, you ever heard of Roger Ray? Ever heard of progressive faith and practice? Want to make a real difference in today's world? And then invite them to come on this journey. So here in Springfield, some examples might be Crosslines Food Pantry and Safe to Sleep, a temporary homeless shelter for women. Perhaps it is the weekly protest at the corner of a major intersection, lifting up the rights of LGBTQ folks or other issues in our community. Perhaps it is a knitting group or a quilting group that donates their efforts to those in need. When I was in Berryville, Arkansas, I had a church there. I was also a hospital chaplain, and Laura was the director of nursing. I'm reminded of a biker group that knitted blankets for newborns and donated them to the local hospital. Potential progressives. May not look like it, but their actions show that they are. And don't forget that there are lots of folks who have dropped out of the mainline churches because they don't see the church do what Jesus wanted them to do. Take care of real folks with real issues. And don't forget that there are many people that are not part of the Springfield community. We reach 15,000 folks every month. So out there in the etherland, what can you do? Perhaps you can go to where the potential fish are, where they congregate. These are the right places to go to evangelize potential progressives. But make sure that you ask these folks to join us in the streets and invite them to listen to an empowering message each week to get energized, to move from the pews to the streets. Ask them, you ever heard of Roger Ray? Ever heard of progressive faith and practice? Want to make a real difference in today's world? Check out YouTube and Facebook, our website, Best of the Left podcast. And if you all have not seen or heard the Best of the Left podcast for this week on Friday, Roger Ray was a guest speaker at it. He did a wonderful job. It was great. Plug into Best of the Left. It is one of the best podcasts out there for progressive thinking. Invite them to be on a journey. So besides looking around at your own family and friends and going to the right place, if you're fishing for potential progressives, you also need to use the right bait. Now, what's progressive bait? What attracts potential progressives? Perhaps it's a petition to sign, organized demonstrations or protests. That might be the right bait. Know anyone that might take that bait? Ask them. Have you ever heard of Roger Ray? Have you ever heard of the progressive faith and practice? You want to make a real difference in today's world? And then invite them to come along on this journey. Perhaps it's an invitation to like-minded folks to show up at a social awareness or political activity. Not only invite them, but take them. Know anyone that might be interested in that bait? Ask them. Ever heard of Roger Ray? Ever heard of progressive faith and practice? Want to make a real difference in today's world? And then invite them. Perhaps the right bait is setting up a casserole cooking activity that results in taking casseroles to the homeless shelter or the food pantry. Know anyone that might like this bait? Ask them. You ever heard of Roger Ray? Ever heard of progressive faith and practice? Want to make a real difference in today's world? And then invite them to come along on the journey. Right bait, might be inviting people to give up old, serviceable, still serviceable shoes and take them or send them to needy folks overseas. This is the right kind of bait. These are activities that focus on making this world a better place. Progressives and potential progressives love this stuff. Know anyone that might like that bait? Invite them to be part of the journey. Encourage others and yourself to financially support the progressive ministry of this church that reaches up to about 15,000 social media viewers each month and engages in local, national, and international outreach. This church barely makes it financially each month. I don't know if you're aware of that. As the new treasurer, I see this up close and personally each week. We desperately need regular and sustained financial help in order to get the progressive message out. The progressive message is part of the bait. Each dollar that you give helps spread the progressive message and provide the platform for local, national, and worldwide action and mobilizing people to have FOS, feet on the street. Know anyone that might like this bait? Ask them. You ever heard of Roger Ray? Ever heard of progressive faith and practice? Want to make a real difference in today's world? And then invite them to come along. Also, buy Roger's books. And if you think about it, go on Amazon and give a favorable rating. I'm sure that you agree that Roger's message are all about getting folks motivated to move from the pews to the streets, from their computers to the halls of power. The internet platform today is the right kind of bait to attract those potential progressive folks and help motivate them to action. Use Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook to share the sermons and Dr. Ray's messages and calls to action. Even if you've heard the message before in person, make a comment in these platforms. It makes a difference. It spreads the word. My bet is that many of your family and friends might resonate with the message and call to action in order to make life and living better for other folks in the world. Know anyone that might like that bait? Ask them. Have you ever heard of Roger Ray? Ever heard about making a difference through progressive faith and practice? Want to make a real difference in today's world? Invite them to come along on this journey. So, besides checking out your own acquaintances and going to the right place and using the right bait, you have to have the right attitude. A true progressive attitude is that of being hopeful. It is about taking action, making this world a better place, a fairer place, a more just place, a healthier place to live, despite the often overwhelming negative cultural messages we hear on the radio and in cable TV. The message is not about salvation, being saved. It is not about eternal punishment and reward. It's not about guilt, exclusivity, or dividing people up. It's about bringing people together and seeing possibilities and opportunities. It is an attitude of openness that is shown by valuing all folks just like Jesus valued all folks, regardless of their sexual orientation or whom they choose to love. The progressive attitude acknowledges that certain hues of skin have a greater challenge than others with a lighter hue to their skin. The progressive attitude is that of truth-telling, oftentimes to people with power, and making sure that all people are included in the discussion and the solutions. The attitude of a progressive is that of a relentless pursuit of truth. It is logical, fact-based, and rational, and does not rely on myths, magic, or superstition. The progressive attitude is grounded in reality. The progressive attitude is that of congruity, walking the talk, preaching all the time, and occasionally using words. It's about the journey from Sunday to Monday, from the pews to the streets. It's about experiencing the sacred by engaging the profane. Know anyone that might like this bait? Ask them. Ever heard of Roger Ray? Ever heard of progressive faith and practice? Want to make a real difference in the world? Invite them to come along on this journey. In the end, evangelism within the progressive community is really not a message per se, but people with a message and a desire to act that they cannot keep to themselves. Isn't that us? Isn't that us? So, I want us to be honest. After all, that's what being progressive is all about. Are we having bites? Fellow fishers of people, are we having bites? Are we individually or collectively reaching out and fishing for progressive folks and introducing them to a positive, inclusive, proactive, change-focused way of living? If not, we're probably in the wrong place, or using the wrong bait, or our attitude is not coming across loud and clear. It simply doesn't work to change the message on the church signboard. It doesn't work to prop open the doors on Sunday morning with the hope that progressives will swim in and park themselves in a chair and sit passively waiting to be entertained by a great sermon and music. It doesn't even work to pride ourselves on being a friendly congregation and to welcome visitors who somehow manage to make it out of bed and into their cars and down the street and through our doors and into the pews. If we want to make a big catch, we've got to go to where the fish are, use the right bait, and have the right attitude. Let's be like my son-in-law, Kevin. Crank up our potential progressive fish finders and idle around until we can spy a school of potentially progressive disciples and go fishing. If the fish are families with young children who are dealing with balancing work and home life, let's volunteer to look after the kids so that their parents can have a night off. If the fish are young adults who will probably be looking at opportunities to serve folks, one of the characteristics of the millennial generation is the passion for service in the environment. Let's show up at a Save the Planet rally and chat with folks. Tell them about the progressive movement and about the progressive church. The progressive church is not your parents' church anymore. The progressive movement is about change. It's about making a change to help this world, this time, and next generations a better place. And what about the seniors? Let's not forget that many of them of these older folks are looking for a legacy, looking for a way of connecting and being involved. So, one of the things that I'm hoping to do is go on a cruise to experience the huge climatological changes that are happening in our world. Not just to see them for myself, but to hopefully connect with people that are of like minds. And I'm going to ask them, have you ever heard of Roger Ray? Ever heard of progressive faith and practice? Want to make a difference in this world? I want to meet others who are concerned about our planet. So I'll give them Roger's card and invite them to check out the progressive messages. In your bulletins, I ask that there's be a Roger's card in there. I would like to challenge each of you to give that card to somebody that might be a potential progressive. Give that card to them. Have them call Roger. Have them go online. Check us out. When I sense someone might be a possible progressive, I'll send them one of Roger's books and his card. I've already done that 6 times already. Admittedly, most of these folks will never darken the church of this church, okay? Because they're located some other place. But is that really what progressives are all about? Tall steeples, huge buildings, mega Christmas and Easter programs, countless baptisms, and BIPs? Or is being a progressive about FOS? Change, here and now, making life and living better for others. This is no limit fishing. So we'll catch whatever we can, whenever we can, and however we can, because the progressive movement is that important. It is so countercultural. It is the message that Jesus preached 2,000 years ago, and it is our message today. Do you have a progressive message inside of you that you simply can't keep it to yourself? Do you have a fish story about your faith journey and your desire to do something to make life and living better every time you tell it? If so, are you ready to go fishing? Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.